Hey, everybody, welcome back to the next episode of the Thoughtful Solutions Podcast. I'm your host, Matt.
And I am your co-host, Chris.
Today's episode is going to be talking about national and class conflict as a result of a competitive market system. It's going to be a cool discussion here. And as a preview as well for next week, as we like to give you guys, we are going to be talking about charity and philanthropy and why it is a band aid. That one will be pretty interesting as well. But for today's episode, we're kind of going to outline it in two different facets. We're going to, again, talk about the national side of things. So, referencing war, globalism, the inequality spread about through the different levels of countries that exist out there. And then we're going to shift the focus towards a smaller scale, talking about the class conflict, more of individual inequality, and talking about labor struggles, stuff like that, and then sort of tying it all back into the systems approach that we like to have here on the podcast.
Yes,
So,
sir.
when talking about national conflict, the first thing that comes to mind is war. War is the biggest outcropping of conflict. It's literally people fighting people, interspecies conflict, where we are killing each other, whether it's for ideological reasons, nationalistic reasons, or pure resource acquiring motives. There's a whole host of different reasons for this. Sometimes, if a country is not the aggressor, there can be a defensive motive to it as well, but it's very much the onus on the aggressor that is something to look at here. So it's really the embodiment of conflict that is what war is. And throughout sort of the modern history of human civilization, we're talking around the Neolithic Revolution and forward, there has always been an element of tribalistic conflict or nationalistic or civilization versus civilization conflict, and it's typically been manifested in this way. And there is always going to be an economic and resource based motive for these sort of interactions. And yes, you could look at something like the Crusades, where it was very much had like a religious undertone to it, or some of the early Muslim conflicts following the Crusades, but largely there's always going to be some sort of resource gathering, acquiring land, making an empire bigger. That is really going to be the onus that war is done under. But there's always a pretense. There's always some kind of sparking incident that allows the people in power to sort of galvanize everybody to come forth, whether it's again for an ideological reason or for following your nationality and some sort of greater zeitgeist that has been manifested. But largely enough, it can rarely be justified, especially from the aggressor's perspective. So, war, it never changes. Oh,
I
man.
wasn't ready for that. I didn't know you were going to do that.
But yeah, what do you kind of see as the Otis here for war, Chris?
Well, even when I think about it, like as far back as, even kind of earlier wars and more primal and whatnot, like you said, the reasons behind it all kind of fall under the same umbrella. Whether it is like, you can say a lot of it was like land grabbing or, the resource grabbing or, even a couple, like you said, where it's really just like a religious motivation. But even those, like, somebody's profiting in some type of way always off of a war. And even the wars where, like you had mentioned, if you're on the defensive side and you kind of like, you could say you have a more like morally just reason for being in the war. Like absolutely that could be there as well. But, you know, something is going to benefit. Like the steel manufacturing companies that benefit from war, pharma companies that benefit from war, and the injured people that come back. Like even if you can find I don't know how you could say the purest war out there, but even if you could like pick the most justified war in history, there you're still gonna find like ways that someone used the system to make a gains out of that war, which obviously means putting some other country or type of people down, because that's the system that we're in. That's the ideal like mindset of being in a competitive market like this where you need to take kind of any action necessary to get gains over your competitors or your enemy in that case, make them your enemy, and then you have all the reasons and justification necessary to profit off of them.
I think a quote that sort of highlights that is the World War II General Smedley D. Butler. He made a book on it as well, but the quote is "War is a racket,"
Hmm.
especially in the modern context, but obviously that can be expanded on through history as well. And it very much shows that there is a systemic economic component to it. There's
Yeah.
a lot of industries that benefit, and as well, it's always the populace that ends up putting their lives on the line for the gains of individuals that really don't have any leg in the game as opposed to their safety. You don't see the president grabbing a M4 Garand and charging the beach on D-Day. Like that's, it's going to be Joe Schmo from Wyoming that's doing that. It's
Yeah.
very much a value disorder of, we're going to throw waves and waves of people for something that is not truly justified. Again, you can have the defensive caveat, but even then, the scale at which it occurs, there's hundreds of thousands of people that die, and for the larger wars, we're talking millions. And
Right.
this is a process that occurs. Violence is a process to a large degree. There are very niche cases, obviously, when you look at it on an individualistic scale. Yes, individuals can commit heinous acts, but as a whole, especially in this sort of context, it's going to be a process. There's a system behind it, there's benefactors that are reaping the rewards, and the majority of those involved in the conflict are just going to have negative outcomes.
Yeah, yeah, which is where we were talking about earlier how this is all just a big example of systemic violence. Because, I mean, literally without this system in place worldwide, the wars wouldn't have the same motivation behind them. Or if, or maybe not even depending on obviously like, oh, a utopia where there's no wars, but still, if there was a system that didn't incentivize, people of in certain positions to basically like do really corrupt things, then yeah, in a better system, like we wouldn't have this type of conflicts because it's not a natural conflict, it's a systemic one. It's like this only happens because of the system that we're in right now.
And there's literal industries that are built off this. The makers of weapons of death, like
Hmm.
those gun companies, the companies that make war machines and bombs and all kinds of stuff. There's literal economic connections and incentives behind why these things occur. And if wars aren't happening, these companies aren't making money. And if they aren't making money, they obviously have their hands in the government because the government is nothing more than an outcropping of the economic system. So there's always going to be some kind of Otis, especially taking into context like Vietnam, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, all that stuff, some of the more modern wars that have occurred. It's there's no justification. I mean, for Vietnam it was like, "Oh, we got to stop communism. We got to create some kind of safety border to stop it from spreading." And then, 50, 100,000 American soldiers die. We end up killing millions of civilians in Asia, destroy the landscapes, and just decimate these countries. And there's also an element that the violence in the process of war also sort of cements the hierarchy that already exists on the global scale. You don't see sub-Saharan African countries like Chad, Sudan, Ghana. You don't see them stretching their fingers out, having 800 military bases around the world, and going out and being the aggressors in these large national scale conflicts. It's always the already cemented superpowers, especially looking towards the US, that really go out and become these sort of entities. And it's because again there's already a hierarchy established, and with the amount of money and the discretionary budget spent on war, there's always going to be some money to throw around to have these conflicts continue.
Yeah, yeah, almost like a positive feedback loop in a type of way. Like, fund all this money into it, the operation gets bigger. As the operation gets bigger, calls for more money to be funded into it, which makes the operation get even bigger. Now, like you said, it's like I think, out of the 193 or 97 countries in the world, we have bases in like 114 or 100 some vast majority like that.
Oh yeah, there's always going to be these sort of fingers stretching out and trying to get as much as possible to try and really cement that geopolitical control that an entity like the US has. And it's very
Mhm.
much important to realize as well that we are getting to the point where war is very much an antiquated system. Just like free market capitalism is an old, outdated socioeconomic mode, war is very much an old way of solving conflicts. And I'm not going to say this about China that I'm about to mention because I'm praising them in any means, but just to give an idea of what sort of the evolution of what these conflicts look like. So China has been doing something called, I think it's like the Silver Road Initiative or the Silver Belt Initiative, something like that. And instead of going to war with all these countries that are around them and really doing like land grab scenarios, they're focusing on the economic component. They're going to these countries and saying, hey, we'll give you these loans, we'll set up infrastructure in your country, we'll do this, that, and the other thing. But you're going to be beholden to us. And unfortunately, because China is one of those superpowers, a lot of these countries are like, yeah, we'll do it. I mean, we need new highways, we need new power systems, water systems, whatever, because they're already down on that economic rung. And there's really nothing to lose from that perspective. So, as opposed to just going and focusing on outright violence, I think a trend, especially in this system currently, is going to be shifting towards economic control. And
Mhm.
that is very malicious in a way, but at least there's no, like there is a recognition that the violence and the amount of death and resources that go into a process like war is very much a wasteful endeavor. The
Right.
Yeah, the only people that benefit again are those at the top, those that are in power, and again, it just cements that inequality. Whereas I think with what China is doing, they're like, okay, let's take a step back. If we make these countries that are around us a little bit better, sort of lift them up, they're our direct neighbors, we make them beholden to us in a non-violent degree, we're going to be able to really increase our sphere of influence, which is going to be an interesting perspective because I think the US is lagging behind in that. But
Yeah.
again, China is a super capitalist, hyper industrial nation, and I think them going towards this perspective, it's a trend change. It's something we're going to see, but we'll time will tell if others will catch on to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like they realized they got to move on from the old ways that don't work anymore, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the new way they're doing has like good intentions behind it, but it is better. Like
Yeah,
the mean is better.
yeah, definitely not good intentions because clearly they're already still beholden to the socioeconomic system that is causing these issues in the first place, but it's
Yeah.
definitely an interesting trend. And then to expand upon this as well, you can equivocate class inequality to a global scale as well. Again, we have the industrialized first world countries, your China's, United States, countries of Europe and stuff. But we also clearly have developing and then the third world countries, where a lot of these countries really emulate the middle and lower class that we see in a lot of these nations. And this is again a form of structural violence. Absolute and relative poverty do nothing but decrease public health metrics and really drag down the progress of society as a whole. But with something like capitalism, inequality is built into the system. It's something that is a caustic force, but is required for the amount of resource consumption and having those at the top. You can't have somebody like the Bezoses and the Elon Musks and whatever without having a highly stratified unequal system. They get
Yeah.
they get the big slice of the pie
Yeah,
and
and you can see that when you look at different levels of countries. It's almost like, the superpower countries are equal to like the Bezoses and the Waltons and whatnot. And then, like you were saying, the Chads and the freaking other just third worlds are almost like the lower class.
yeah, they're like the poor people you see on the street that
The equivalent, yeah.
which is very much a reality that has been exemplified and expounded upon because the system has been in place for so long. There was a
Yeah.
point where a lot of these countries, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago, where they were just totally separate from the globalized system because it was sort of coming into its own. It wasn't really globalized in that perspective, but especially during the 19th and 20th century when the Industrial Revolution, Malthusian trap was broken, all that kind of jazz, and the world started to become more interconnected, we started to see the differentials between these nation states really pop up and sort of be expounded upon.
Hmm.
So it's again, it's another form of conflict, not direct like the war that we were talking about, but you can clearly see that these nations have much higher infant mortality rates and just levels of death, disease, preventable illnesses, low literacy rates, you name it. These countries are the example of where these occur. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have the nations that have been established for a long time and have been a part of the hierarchy that still sort of exists in this modern system where they don't have as much of those consequences.
And like you were saying, they're not separate from the system. It's not like a third world country isn't also a part of the world with all these other superpowers in place. They're tied into it as well. They're just ended up in their spot where the system has placed them lower on the scale.
Yeah, and we could even go back to the example that we had in our first episode talking about Salvador Allende in Chile. They were really the first country that kind of wanted to step back and say, whoa, we're going to try and actually do our own thing and sort of disconnect the tendrils that have been grabbing us for so many years and do really start our own system and do our own thing. And it's very much hard for a lot of these countries to go down that route because their sphere of influence and their ability to sort of stop these kind of changes is very low. And clearly with what happened in Chile with Allende being assassinated, a coup being funded by the US government, and everything sort of going to shambles because of the military strife that occurred, it there's always an incentive to go against somebody who's trying to do something different because you God forbid you upset the hierarchy and try and do something different.
Yeah, yeah. Those people at the top are very powerful. They'll have your ass assassinated.
Oh yeah. But again, you got to look at this from a structuralist point of view. The people that are at the top, they are there due to a system outcome. They
Yeah,
aren't necessarily malicious in their own way. Yes, you could say their moral compass and their sense of what to do in that regard are definitely skewed. But again, they're nothing more than a product of the system. They're the
yeah.
epitome of an outcome of what the system produces. So you have to look at what root causes brings about these politicians, the generals, the military industrial complex, the captains of industry, all these kind of people. They are merely the creme de la creme of what the system produces. And you got to sort of disconnect yourself from the boogeyman fallacy. You can't say, oh, if we just replaced all of our congresspeople, or we replaced the president, or we replaced this person or that person, then everything will be fine. We went back towards the good old days. Like, no, no. It was the same system that we've been a part of for thousands of years that has caused these outcomes. And it's going to continue occurring unless we really start to galvanize that change.
Do you remember your maglev anecdote? Your about why are we talking about reinventing the wheel when we have maglev technology?
Yeah,
Remember?
exactly.
Yeah. This is almost like, as far as replacing a president to make the system better, it's like you're just replacing the driver of this old ass wagon when we're trying to like fucking replace the wagon over here.
Yeah, there's we are very much beyond those means. But yeah, that's sort of the idea with the national conflict. It's very much, again, as a result of the global socioeconomic system, exemplified in war and national inequality, which really trickles down towards the next point here, which is the class conflict. And this kind of manifests in a few different ways. The first one is, as I alluded to when we talked about the national side of things, is the class inequality, the lower, middle, and upper classes, and the amount of friction and material well being that is displaced between these classes. And then talking about sort of labor struggles and the worker owner class dynamic that has always been around for a while, and sort of the caustic nature of what this inequality produces. It's going to kind of touch on the public health perspective a little bit that we talked about in our public health episode, and really seeing how this side of the equation also feeds into the national side of things. So
Mm.
you're always going to have this division in a system like capitalism, as I mentioned before. You're always going to have those at the top, those at the bottom, and it's those at the bottom that really feel the consequences and the negative externalities of what the system produces. And with the majority of the population of the planet, regardless of what country you're looking at, being in that lower socioeconomic rung, it very much shows how pervasive a lot of these negative consequences end up being. And we've seen trends, especially during, again, the 19th and 20th century, with the labor revolution and workers sort of banding together, realizing, hey, we've been screwed over for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Let's try and make something happen. In the US, this was sort of exemplified with occurrences like the Pinkerton riots that occurred in the late 19th century, where you had workers actually striking and trying to create a situation that was really sort of an evolution of these relationships. And you've even seen more modern manifestations of that where people have shifted towards like worker owned co-ops and companies that don't have your traditional dictatorship hierarchy, like most, if not every, company has nowadays. So the trends are going in a direction of really decentralizing the system, but overall, it's the inequality generated from the system itself that is going to keep these things being so pervasive.
Right, right. Because as we see. Like with these boom and bust type cycles. Every time that that happens, the people that are on the low class, they just get lower. And then you see the top, especially the top 1%, the gap just gets bigger and bigger every time that we go through some sort of like giant systemic issue.
Yeah, they always end up feeling the consequences of the system, and yeah, the people at the top might lose a little money, and
Hmm.
they might be out a few million, but they'll bounce back in the next few
Yeah.
years, making even more than they did before, because that's the trends that we look at. That it is the reality of this sort of system is it's always going to keep funneling the majority of the resources up towards the top, and it's going to do nothing but increase the amount of disparity between the classes and to increase the amount of occurrence of the negative public health metrics that we have talked about before.
Again, it's all systemic violence. This isn't just, something that you come across because something natural happened in your life. Like this is a result of the system itself that you're in.
And the violence, as Chris alluded to, is not manifested in sort of a direct way. It is as a result of the system. If you die of heart disease at the age of 45 because of your socioeconomic class due to your lack of resource access and healthcare, food, different aspects of that, is is that not as bad as somebody walking up and shooting you? Like, you're dead either way. One's just caused as a result of the system, whereas the other is an individual causing the act of violence. So either way, the end result is the same, and one is going to be way more likely to occur as opposed to the other one. And you can just look at it based off of how many people a year die in different countries from these sort of lower socioeconomic situations. When it comes to these diseases, it's always going to be manifested in a way like that. And I think, again, tying it back to having that structuralist perspective and realizing that, okay, some people that might not be as versed in these realities would point the finger at different things. Like, I got a coworker who he always says, "Oh, if we change again the people in Congress and the Senate and those politicians and stuff, and we get in people who actually represent the people of the U.S., everything will be fine." Well, no, those people are in that position because of the economic incentives to do so. And as people really become ingrained in those positions of power, regardless of the motives, you're going to see a wearing down of these individuals, whether their intentions are good or not. Again, there's only so much that these individuals can do. And not only that, but those who are in power are there because of how they relate to the economic side of things. That's why you have the donor class, those who really control the political sort of mindset that is very pervasive, because you can never take away the economic component of how a government functions. And as we've mentioned before as well, with the government being a ineffective regulator to try and even the playing field, and with it merely being a tool to help keep this current system going, there's never going to be that whole heart change just by saying, "Oh, let's change those in office and everything will be good." No, because the system itself hasn't changed.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. It's the thought that just re-electing people to try and solve these problems is actually going to get anywhere is silly to me. When like even on an individual level, you could be doing things in your life to change your responsibility and be more active towards fighting things of these topics that we're talking about. Like if you know that you're in a bit of a food desert and it's affecting your health and you're going to be at risk of being a heart disease statistic by the end of the year, then you yourself could actually start making moves to fix that issue instead of hoping that while you sit and elect this guy into office, he's going to fix that issue.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast is it's very much a lack of education and a lack of people understanding a different perspective. And if people realize that there are alternatives and you sort of point out what is the root cause of a lot of these things, as opposed to just pointing fingers at individuals or different groups, yeah, the picture really starts to become clear. And those who are in those situations that Chris had just mentioned really start to realize that, oh, I can try and put my effort towards electing some individual that may or may not do something good, but the onus is really on me to try and better my situation, but to also be an advocate for change because I am a part of the majority of people that are in that lower economic situation. So I did want to ask you something here, Chris. So
Okay.
as we've continued through these episodes, we are getting relatively close to the end of the Foundations playlist. How has your train of thought developed? Because that's definitely something that we like to expound upon in this podcast. It's sort of an evolution of thought as we go through these conversations and have these discussions. How has your perspective on sort of system science and the global socioeconomic system, how has that sort of shifted as we've gone through these episodes?
One thing I noticed pretty quickly, actually, after we started doing this more often, was the normal topics that would come up in conversations day to day with people, friends and family, when, eventually someone brings up a topic, it's a problem that they're dealing with or something they don't like about society. Before we were doing this, we would just, in my head, I would riff on about whatever that problem was they're talking about. Now, however, anytime something like this is mentioned, like for example, just like here in America, maybe like, some class issue that we're dealing with, like police and race or rights that you have as an individual. Um, I go, I'm able to, in my own mind, go like a step deeper than the usual train of thought as to why that's a problem. And now I'm thinking things of like, okay, how did that come about because of the system that we're in? Like, what what aren't we talking about that actually got us to this point of conflict instead of, trying to just put a band-aid over whatever conflict we're talking about now? Like, it's it's hard because, when you start thinking about these deeper rooted issues of the system, is you might almost think like there's not much that you could do about it, but it's comforting at the same time to know that all these issues, they aren't little personal issues that have come about just because of some silly problem, that it's actually, we're all individuals kind of are on the same page. We're just dealing with these like much larger systemic issues. And I would love to have like everyone looking at it at a systems base instead of just like at a surface level base, and then we, could actually start having real conversations about fixing some issues or the right way to fix some issues or mind changes about it. So like that's been the most notable change for me, and it's it's like it's hard to bring that up in conversation though when we're talking about whatever issue that we are, just like, with my dad or something, we're talking about a problem, and then I would have to like reference our YouTube channel or reference like the Foundations playlist and be like, man, you need to get caught up on all this stuff and you could be on the same page as me because we're talking about the same thing here, but I'm on a whole nother different like level of understanding of why this is an issue. And, God, I wish you were there too.
People really easily default to individual responsibility. It's somebody saying that, oh, they're just stupid or they made a bad decision, it's their fault. Whereas there is very much a larger systemic element to it. And unfortunately, one thing where we is sort of communicating this perspective that we have here on the podcast, it's not something that's quippy. There's little sound bites you can throw out like, ah, screw the liberals, or ah, it's all the Republicans, or man, we just need to get these CEOs out of the office and take all their shit, or whatever. There's no like easy little sound bite that you can throw out that makes you seem like you're competent on any topic. Unfortunately, when trying to communicate these larger systemic trains of thought, it's a process. There's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid, and it's not easy. People default to what is easy. And when it comes to this sort of communication, it takes time. You know, you could sit down with 3 or 4 hours with somebody and really lay down the legwork and try and have a productive conversation. But most people, unfortunately, are not going to really want to dive that deep. And
Mm-hmm.
it's unfortunate to see that you really need to wear down the walls of communication. You start with those that are close to you that are willing to sort of give you the time to explain these things and to go about it, and starting the little seed that we're trying to plant here to really change the perspective that people have. But it's again, it's not an easy process. It's not something that is really done in a short amount of time. You know, you can't have a 5 minute conversation about global capitalism and socioeconomic change and have somebody be on the same page as you. You really
Mm-hmm.
need to have sort of an idea of where to drive a conversation like that, and to really just stick to your guns to a degree. Don't fall into the trap of sort of agreeing with somebody that might have more of a simplistic worldview. Again, like referencing my coworker who's just up, take those people out of Washington, everything will be good. Well, no, it's not that simple. And once you sort of pique that curiosity, you can have a multitude of conversations throughout your relationship in that span of time that will really start to generate a knowledge set that is actually useful, something that actually changes a perspective and makes people realize that these issues are deeper. And I think that's definitely going to be a challenge. Again, that's a reason why we're doing this podcast, giving somebody a referent point to start at so that when conversations are had, there's another perspective. There's more elements that people can look at. And
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of a backlog of useful content that not only that we're producing, there are clearly others that are in the same field. Again, we look at uh, especially the Zeitgeist movement, the work that Peter Joseph does. This is very much another avenue that has a lot of educational material, especially if you want to dive into the more nitty gritty side of things, which is amazing. There are other referent materials that somebody can go at and really expand their knowledge set. So it's about planting that seed, trying to have people go out and look at things from a different perspective and do their own sort of digging by listening to these different perspectives.
Yeah, I think one of the best concepts to try to understand in the beginning to really open your mind to, like system science would be just understanding, and we've mentioned this before, how we're not trying to demonize the system, and we're also not trying to advocate for some other system that's also not done too well. We're like, you need a blank page, and you need to start building from the bottom up. We want to build a whole different system that actually takes into consideration externalities and multiple different levels of recursion, and ties back into nature more often to be more viable. But yeah, to really, I think, to hop on the train and actually be on this train of thought, you kind of have to not be so defensive. And
Yes.
in order to not be so defensive, I think it's important to understand, like, we're not attacking anybody. We're not attacking capitalism or advocating for communism or some shit. This is it's looking at the system as a whole and how it works. That's what system science is about.
Yeah, and I think that's an amazing point to start with is just trying to explain to somebody that the tell them what free market capitalism is. A lot of people, especially your more common folk, don't really understand the system they're a part of. These people say, "Yep, capitalism is the best. It's the best way to go. It got us where we are here. It's the thing." You could ask them, "Well, do you understand the referent mechanics of capitalism? Do you understand
Mm-hmm.
the labor purchaser industrialist cycle? Do you understand externalities? Do you understand, the monetary system, fiat currencies, all the real interworkings of how the system functions, fractional reserve banking, the dictatorship hierarchies that are a part of any corporate structure. Like, start with the real stuff. Like, say, okay, this is how capitalism functions, and look at it again. Try and introduce that system's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and point out that there have been little outcroppings, but really something like communism, socialism, and the other sort of capitalistic outcroppings aren't wholly different from what we live in now. And I think you brought up a very good point as well. It's not about demonizing the system or saying that it's it's got to burn to the ground, and that it's the absolute worst thing that's ever occurred. Like, yes, we can see what the negative outcomes are, but you got to come at it from it's old. It's an outdated technology. It's a
Mm-hmm.
system that doesn't function, and our technical reality and our scientific understanding are not jiving and matching with this economic component of things, because none of that is put into perspective. Again, that's why
Yep.
it's such an outdated system.
Exactly. Exactly. We could do better.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that that would be a good point, but it is cool to see that sort of development. And once this Foundations playlist gets sort of finished up here in the next, I think, like 3 videos, I believe, we'll sort of do a recap here, and we'll come back and really see how your thought process has developed, Chris, and I'll kind of give
Yeah.
a perspective as well as we move into the future of the channel. Yeah, but
Uh,
I think that will definitely be the end of today's episode, guys. Tune in next week when we talk about charity philanthropy and why it is a band-aid. And we're going to look forward to having that conversation. But thanks for sticking with us, guys. We'll catch you in the next episode.